a woman's mind is much like a room not often visited. Quiet, modest, but filled with much more than one would expect. Since childhood, my mind has often been filled with characters, conversations, and places desperate to be written on the page. My name is Miss Austen, and for those of you who don't know me, I am one of 8 children, daughter to a country clergyman. My childhood was very simple. The only real excitement came from the occasional rainy carriage ride, but I had my imagination, and in that I found an escape to the grandness of wealth. Although my mother and I never got along, I have to admit she was the true inspiration for my love of fiction. Being a writer herself, she taught me as best she could. A woman would never have been formally trained, of course. I acquired a simple education, poor French taught by my cousin, many hours of needlepoint by candlelight, and a short time at boarding school, here in Oxford, but extensive reading was all I needed. I've read every book in our parsonage many times over, inspiring me to write short stories of my own to entertain myself. But, to my disappointment, apart from the occasional letter or particularly fine recipe, writing was not considered a serious accomplishment for a lady. I too wrote hundreds of letters. When circumstances forced my sister and myself apart, there was no greater joy than to delight in each other's stories of life. My darling Cassandra knew me so well and inspired many of the strong but dependable women in my stories. Being the only 2 girls, we grew close as children, and I looked up to her and doted on her. We travelled all over the country together. On my father's retirement, we set forth for Bath. It was idealised as a place of health and relaxation, but the reality was vastly underwhelming. After the fresh country air at home, Bath was dank and cramped with polluted waters and diseases running riot. I was quite glad once we'd left. I'm sure your English teachers will have told you that I accepted the proposal of a man only to reject him the next day, and please write in your exams how I explored my own potential loveless marriage through the life of Miss Charlotte Lucas. But in reality, I had a number of engagements in my time, some with rather charming prospects, but I could never marry. The critics all said, how can a woman who writes so much about love and relationships not have lived these experiences herself? Because I chose to be independent. The women of my stories were never the greatest rebels. Elizabeth, Eleanor, Emma, they simply spoke with intelligence and were not afraid to think. My characters lived their lives in accordance with society's expectations, but they remained strong in the face of adversity, even when they were expected merely to marry. Of course, I was never permitted to take ownership of my books. They were published anonymously by a lady. Whilst many suspected I was the true author, for my own safety and for my family's reputation, I had to remain a secret. For should a woman step too boldly into the public eye, it's not only her reputation that would be ruined. And yet, in my quiet rebellion, I found a sense of freedom. I could write about the ridiculousness of courtship rituals, the vanity of wealth, and the absurd rules that govern the lives of women. I shamelessly mocked my own family and friends, exaggerating their characteristics in a way I hope they would never realise, but I like to think I had the ability to make my audience laugh, and at the best of times, think. Some may say I was confined by the world I lived in, but within those borders, I found my own rebellion, not through strong acts of revolution, but with subtle critiques. I often wonder what a woman of the future may be. Will she be bolder or still sit and quietly observe? Perhaps it does not matter, so long as she writes.
I was born into a world of idealism and chaos, or in other words, America, Boston to be specific. My father, Austen Alcott, changed his surname to create the facade of a distinguished gentleman, so our name Alcott was invented. He was brilliant and gentle, but utterly impractical. His ideals would now be celebrated and praised, but unfortunately, you can't eat your ideas. He was a teacher, determined to improve education and help others. back when he ran a school in Boston, he accepted a black student. Her name was Susan Robinson. He thought little of his actions at the time, knowing that every person has the right to a good education. But the next morning, Austen Alcott School had lost all students but Susan and his daughters. Every other parent had removed their child. This led to closure and forced us to move out of the only home I'd ever known. We left for Concord. Growing up, I worked hard. I cleaned, taught, sewed, but mostly I wrote. Not because I dreamed of fame, though I did, but because my family needed to survive. My hundreds of short stories, all published anonymously, helped to provide as much as possible. They say I'm best known for Little Women, but that was such a quiet and domestic story, not at all the one that I wanted to tell. I loved writing mystery, adventure, passion, but the publishers asked for a book for girls, so I gave them a piece of my life instead. Meg, Jo, Beth, Amy, those were my sisters, my childhood, created into a work of fiction. My eldest sister, Anna, was as sweet as Meg, the beloved belle of our household. Lizzie, our quiet angel, was the heart of the family, and she became Beth, my gentle saint who was taken too soon. And Abby, the youngest, had a streak of mischief and charm, and she later renamed herself May, hoping for a touch of elegance, and she inspired my blonde, blue-eyed Amy. And there was my mother, our Marmee, wise, patient, endlessly loving. She was too good for this wicked world. And then there was Jo. She was the truest version of me, wild, stubborn, aching to write something real. But the publishers, they demanded romance. I wanted her to stay free, but they couldn't stand the thought of a woman who chose herself. So in my second book, Jo married, though I admit she never should have. That was the deal, though. Tell the truth, as long as it's dressed well enough to sell. Even in our successes, we mold to a man's opinion. I've lived through the war. I held the hands of dying men, wrote final words to mothers far away. And from that, my writing grew heavier, maybe quieter too. But still, I wrote, because writing was how I made sense of the world, and because somewhere I truly believed that girls should be able to view themselves as imperfect, as complex and flawed people with the ability to be ambitious. I often wonder if the great men ever thought of me. Sir Walter Scott, Jonathan Swift, Charles Dickens. But truly, it was the women I longed to hear from, because it was their stories, the ones who wrote fiercely like me, that inspired me the most. And from the confines of the world, they forced women's voices into the spotlight. And I like to think that Jo never stopped writing, just as I never did.
Writing as a woman was never easy.
I like to think that my writing said everything.
I realised perhaps I was too subtle, too quiet.
Of course, I wanted to shout out sometimes. Little Women was not the story I wanted to tell, but it helped to pay the bills.
I wrote anonymously. It seemed safer that way.
Oh, for the safety of a woman. I wanted Jo to remain wild and free, but the men demanded marriage.
And then there's the victory of matrimony, an ending I became all too familiar with.
Yet, I still wrote for my family, for myself.
I ignored my own small world and filled my mind with intelligent women who were quietly rebelling.
But we both bent the rules, didn't we?
Yes, and let's hope that people listened.
Do you think we changed anything?
Not everything, but we left a crack in the door for someone else to walk through.
Or maybe they'll run.